Picture this, a dining room so vast and silent, the quiet itself feels heavy, like the thick velvet curtains blocking out the world. It's a tomb of wealth, dominated by a long mahogany table that could seat 30, but now holds the scraps of a meal for one. At the head of this lonely table sits Arthur Sterling. He's a man in his 60s, and his expensive suit can't hide the bitterness in his eyes or the state-of-the-art wheelchair that is both his throne and his prison. Standing before him is a small, still figure who doesn't belong. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, in clothes that are clean but faded. Her name is Imani, and her eyes are fixed on him, shining with a light this house hasn't seen in years. When she speaks, her voice isn't the timid whisper he expects. It's as clear as a bell on a quiet morning. "Sir," she says, her gaze steady. "I'll trade you a miracle for what's left on your table." Arthur just stares. The nerve, the sheer absurdity of it all, strikes him as so ridiculous that a harsh, rusty sound rattles in his chest. It takes him a second to realize, he's laughing. It's a hollow, mocking sound that bounces off the high ceilings. A miracle, he scoffs, the laugh twisting into a sneer. And what would a little girl in rags know about miracles? Section 1, The Cold Rejection. Imani doesn't flinch. She just watches him, her hands clasped, her posture filled with a quiet dignity. The man's laughter doesn't seem to bother her at all, like it's a storm happening somewhere far away. Arthur's bitter amusement quickly vanishes, replaced by his usual irritation. He's built his world into a fortress to keep people just like this, the messy, the needy, out. Yet, somehow, this child slipped through. "Who are you?" he demands, his voice a low growl. "Who let you in here?" "Thomas." A tall, slender man in a butler's uniform, Thomas, steps out from a shadowy hallway. He's served Arthur for 20 years, since long before the accident, long before his master's heart turned to stone. "Sir?" Thomas asks, glancing at the girl with an unreadable expression. "Remove this intrusion," Arthur commands with a wave of his hand. "And find out which of the staff was stupid enough to let a beggar wander into my dining room. They're fired." Thomas gives a tiny, almost invisible nod. "At once, sir." He takes a gentle step toward Imani. "Come along, miss." But Arthur isn't finished. He leans forward, a cruel glint in his eyes. He wants to crush the ridiculous hope he sees in her, to teach her the lesson life taught him: hope is for fools. "Let me give you some advice, girl," Arthur says, his voice dripping with condescension. "The world doesn't do handouts. And it sure doesn't trade in miracles. Miracles are a fantasy sold to the poor to keep them quiet. The only real power is money. And you clearly don't have any. Now get out." He expects her to cry. To shrink. To finally look at the floor like everyone else. She does none of those things. Instead, she turns to Thomas with a small, polite smile, then looks right back at Arthur. The light in her eyes hasn't dimmed one bit. "The miracle isn't for me to give, sir," she says gently, like she's explaining something simple. "It's for you to receive. It will be waiting when you're ready to see it." She glances one last time at the table, piled high with food that could feed her family for a week, a barely touched roast chicken, bowls of cooling vegetables, a chocolate cake with only one slice gone. Then, without looking back, she turns and follows Thomas out, leaving the leftovers, and the millionaire, in a silence that feels louder than ever. Arthur watches her go, a knot of anger and confusion tightening in his stomach. For the first time in a long time, his own cynicism feels hollow. He looks at the feast of waste in front of him, and the food suddenly seems rotten. "Nonsense," he mutters to the empty room. Utter, sentimental nonsense. But his voice has no conviction. When Thomas returns, Arthur barks, "What are you standing there for? Clear this mess away. I've lost my appetite." "Sir," Thomas says, his voice carefully neutral. "About the young lady. She didn't wander in. I let her in. Arthur's head snaps up. You what? She was at the service entrance, Thomas explains calmly. She wasn't asking for money. She asked to speak with the man of the house about something important. There was a conviction about her, sir. I felt turning her away would have been the bigger mistake. Arthur just stares at his butler, the one man he always thought was completely loyal. For 20 years, Thomas has been a predictable part of the furniture. Now, even he was acting strange. You're becoming a soft-hearted fool, Thomas, Arthur grumbles, but the usual poison is missing from his words. He wheels his chair away from the table. Don't ever do it again. Very good, sir, Thomas says. But as he clears the plates, he sees his master cast a long look back at the empty space where the little girl had stood. Meanwhile, Imani walks back to her neighborhood, the crisp night air on her face. She isn't sad or disappointed. She feels peaceful, like she's just planted a seed in the driest, hardest ground imaginable. All she can do now is pray for rain. She arrives at a small apartment in an old, weathered building. Inside, her mother, Sarah, looks up from the stove, her face kind but etched with worry. Imani? I was worried sick. Are you all right? Imani hugs her mother tightly. Everything is fine, Mama. Did you go to that big house on the hill? Sarah asks, knowing all about her daughter's unshakable faith. I did, Imani says, sitting at their small kitchen table. I met the man. He's so sad, Mama. Sadder than anyone I've ever seen. Sarah sighs, pouring a thin vegetable broth into a bowl. It's all they have. He's a rich man, baby. Rich people have their own kind of troubles. He has so much, but he just throws it away, Imani says, her voice full of a wisdom far beyond her years. His food, his happiness. I think he throws it all in the trash. And did you ask him? Sarah asks hesitantly. I offered him a trade, Imani replies. His leftovers for a miracle. Sarah stops, the ladle hovering over the pot. She looks at her daughter's earnest face, and a wave of love and pride washes over all her worries. And what did he say, my brave girl? He laughed, Imani says simply. But his eyes didn't. His eyes were crying, Mama. I think his heart is paralyzed, too. That night, they hold hands and pray, just like always. But tonight, they don't pray for more food or a bigger apartment. They pray for a lonely millionaire in a big, empty house, that he might find a reason to stop crying on the inside. Section 2, The Echo of Faith. On the surface, the next few days were the same as they had been for the 5 years since the car accident stole the use of his legs. Arthur woke up, was tended to by his staff, and moved through a series of joyless routines. But something was different. The girl, Imani, had become a ghost in his gilded cage. Her words, "It will be waiting for you when you're ready to see it," echoed in the emptiness of his house. He heard them when he was yelling at his lawyers about some corporate merger he didn't care about. He heard them when his relentlessly optimistic physical therapist, David, tried to encourage him. "We can try a new hydrotherapy technique, Mr. Sterling," David would say. "There's new research showing it can help with nerve regeneration." Regeneration? Arthur would sneer. "Don't sell me fantasies. I pay you to manage my decline, not to peddle hope. I deal in reality." But his own words now felt like a lie. He started noticing things he'd long ago trained himself to ignore. The shocking amount of food thrown out after every meal, the way his staff flinched when he entered a room. His fortress was a prison, and he was its only miserable inmate. The paralysis in his legs felt like nothing compared to the paralysis of his spirit. About a week later, Arthur's estranged son, Julian, made a rare visit. Julian had his father's looks but none of his drive, with a soft, entitled air that always set Arthur's teeth on edge. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he got to the point. "Dad, I've got this incredible investment opportunity," he began, his eyes gleaming. "A tech startup. Guaranteed to triple its value in a year. I just need a little seed capital." Arthur stared at him. This was the world he championed. People as transactions. Family as a line of credit. He saw in his son a distorted mirror of himself, all appetite, no soul. "No," Arthur said flatly. "But Dad, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Arthur cut him off. "You see me as a vault you visit, hoping the door is unlocked. The answer is no." Julian's face hardened. "Fine," he spat. "Stay here and rot with your money. Don't call me when you're lonely." "You wouldn't answer," Arthur shot back, "unless you thought I was calling to read you my will." Julian stormed out, slamming the door. The sound echoed through the house, leaving Arthur with the bitter satisfaction of being right. "See?" He wanted to scream. "This is what people are." He turned to Thomas, who had been standing silently in the corner. "You see that, Thomas? That's the real world. Everyone wants something. That little girl was no different. She just had a more creative pitch." Thomas met his master's gaze. But this time, he didn't just nod. "If I may be so bold, sir," Thomas began, his voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Julian learned his values from somewhere. And the young lady, she asked for nothing you weren't already throwing away. It seems to me her request was quite different." The respectful rebuke hung in the air. Arthur was furious, but a deep part of him knew the butler was right. He wheeled himself to the window overlooking his perfectly manicured gardens, a landscape that was beautiful and utterly lifeless. Meanwhile, Imani's faith was something she put into action. After school, she'd go to the community library to read to younger children. She'd check on Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman on her street, and help with her groceries or just sit and listen to her stories. One day, her friend Marcus saw her break her small sandwich in half to share with a boy who forgot his lunch. "Why'd you do that, Imani?" Marcus asked. "Now you're just gonna be more hungry." Imani just smiled. "Mama says a half sandwich shared is more filling than a whole one eaten alone." Back in the mansion, Arthur's nights grew longer. He was plagued by dreams of empty banquet halls and food turning to dust at his touch. And in every dream, he saw the little girl's eyes, watching him not with judgment, but with a deep, bottomless pity. One night, he woke with a gasp, his heart pounding. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling with rage and despair, and knocked it to the floor. It shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Thomas appeared moments later. "Is everything all right, sir?" "No, nothing is all right." Arthur roared, his voice cracking. He waved a hand at the priceless art, the silk sheets. "What's the point of any of this? This house, this money. It's just padding for a coffin, Thomas. I'm already buried." Hot, unfamiliar tears streamed down his face. It was a dam breaking, a 5-year flood of grief and loneliness. Thomas didn't speak. He just walked over, began picking up the pieces of glass, and looked at his master with a compassion Arthur had long forgotten. "Perhaps, sir," Thomas said softly, "you've been looking for life in the wrong places." The fight went out of Arthur. He felt defeated. And in that defeat, there was a strange, terrifying hint of freedom. The next evening, Arthur looked at his dinner, a perfectly roasted duck. He took a few tasteless bites and pushed the plate away. "Thomas," he said quietly. "Sir. Don't throw this away." Thomas paused. "Sir." "Pack it up," Arthur said, not looking at him. "All of it. Find one of those shelters. Take it there." He added, almost to himself, "It's a shame to let it go to waste." He tried to pretend it was just an act of efficiency. But he knew, and he knew that Thomas knew, it was something more. It was the first crack in the ice. As Thomas cleared the table, a genuine, warm smile touched his lips for the first time in years. "A very good idea, sir," he said. "A very good idea indeed." That one act of charity didn't bring Arthur peace. In fact, it made him more restless. Tossing a coin in a well and walking away felt empty. It had nothing to do with the connection he'd seen in Imani's eyes. The trade. A miracle for leftovers. What did she mean? He had to know. 2 days later, he made a decision. "Thomas," he called out. "Find her." Thomas looked up from the morning papers. "Sir." "That girl." "Imani," Arthur said. "Find out where she lives. I need to speak with her." A slow, knowing smile spread across Thomas's face. "I already know, sir. I took the liberty of following her home that first night. I thought it might be prudent information to have." Arthur was surprised, but also grateful. "Good. Take me there. Now." The drive from his hilltop estate down into Imani's neighborhood was like traveling to another planet. The manicured lawns gave way to cracked sidewalks and the chaotic, vibrant pulse of a real community. Arthur stared out the tinted window, a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He felt exposed, and profoundly out of place. They parked at the end of the street. "She lives in that building, sir," Thomas said. "On the ground floor." "All right," Arthur said, taking a deep breath. As Thomas helped him into his chair, children stopped their games to stare. Whispers followed them. Arthur felt 100 eyes on him, conscious not of his wealth, but of his weakness. They found her in a small patch of grass between 2 buildings, turned into a makeshift community garden. She wasn't alone. She was sitting on a bucket, surrounded by a small group of younger children. In the middle of the circle was a platter of cookies. Imani was making sure every child got one before taking the last, broken one for herself. The scene hit Arthur with the force of a punch. The simple, joyful sharing. The stark contrast to his own lonely feasts. This wasn't poverty. This was a different kind of wealth. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder. Then, Imani saw him. Her eyes met his, and she smiled. A warm, welcoming smile, as if she'd been expecting him. She said something to the children and walked toward him. "Hello, sir," she said. "I'm glad you came." All of Arthur's prepared speeches just vanished. I apologize," he stammered. "For how I treated you. I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," she said with startling wisdom. "You were just sad. And hurt." He looked at this child who saw right through his cruelty to the wounded man inside. The last of his defenses crumbled. "Yes," he whispered. "I am." He'd almost brought catering vans, ready to shower her with the only thing he knew how to give, money. How foolish that seemed now. "I want to help," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me what you need." "Anything." Imani just shook her head. "We don't need you to buy us anything, sir." "But," she said, her eyes twinkling, "we were just about to have another cookie. Would you like to share with us?" She held out her hand. It was a simple invitation. But for Arthur, it was the trade. His loneliness for her community. His emptiness for her joy. It was the most important deal of his life. Hesitantly, he took her hand and let her lead him to the circle. The children looked at him with wide, curious eyes as Imani introduced him simply as, "Our new friend, Arthur." He sat there, in his $1,000 suit and his $20,000 wheelchair, and ate a cheap, store-bought cookie. And as he did, surrounded by the laughter of children, a real laugh escaped his lips. A laugh of relief, of disbelief, of pure, unfiltered joy. That was the beginning. Arthur didn't just write a check. He came back. He learned the children's names. He listened to Mrs. Gable's stories. He learned that Imani's mother, Sarah, dreamed of owning a small farm again. His life, once a closed loop of self-pity, now focused outward. He and Imani became partners. He had the resources, she had the vision. They started the Leftovers for Miracles Foundation, collecting and used food from restaurants, starting with his own, and giving it to families in need. For the first time since the accident, he had a purpose. They bought the plot of land next to Imani's building and turned it into a community farm, providing fresh produce for the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, about 6 months later, Arthur was in physical therapy, excitedly telling David about the foundation's new refrigerated truck. And the beauty of it, David, is that it's a simple solution to 2 problems at once, he exclaimed. Mr. Sterling, David said, his voice tight with shock. Your leg. Arthur looked down. His right foot, limp and useless for 5 years, had twitched. He stared at it, focused, and tried to will it to move again. A toe wiggled. It wasn't a miracle cure. It wasn't a return to the man he used to be. It was something more. The paralysis of his spirit had been broken, and his body was slowly beginning to follow. The true miracle was never about walking again. It was the healing of his soul. Conclusion. The final scene isn't a lonely mansion, but a bustling community center. The Leftovers for Miracles logo is on a banner. Families are sharing a meal. Imani, now a teenager, stands at a podium, talking about their plans to expand. Standing beside the stage is Arthur Sterling. He's no longer in a wheelchair. He's on crutches, his body still healing, but his spirit whole. He's surrounded by friends, by the community he once hated and now loved. He catches Imani's eye, and they share a smile. His wealth was no longer a wall to keep people out, but a tool to bring them in. He had traded the cold leftovers of a lonely life for the warm feast of human connection. He had laughed at a little girl's offer of a miracle, only to find she was offering him the one thing he truly needed, a reason to live. True wealth isn't what you have, but what you share. The greatest miracles don't always change our circumstances, they change us. Call to action. What an incredible story, right? We believe stories have the power to change the world, one heart at a time. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for a second chance. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos. We're not just telling stories, we're trying to build a community of hope, just like Arthur and Imani. Until next time, remember to look for the miracles in your own life. You might be surprised where you find them.